Cool.
All right, thank you everybody for being here. Again, I'm Becky, Grady, and I'm a PhD student in the Psychological Science Department. I'm going to be talking to you about some research that I've been doing on getting people to reject fake news that they find online. So, for example, imagine you're scrolling on Facebook one day and you come across this story about Keanu Reeves starting a cat shelter. How do you know if this is true or not? How do you decide? Well, here's a handy guide that I found that makes it very simple for any story. So all you have to do is consider the source, and then read beyond the headline, then find the supporting sources, check the date, check the author and other things they've written, figure out if it's a joke, go to a library and ask an expert, and finally check your own biases. Should be really simple, right? Well, clearly this is kind of a lot to ask everybody to do, particularly for every story that they come across. And this is why it's so important for platforms like social media and online news sites to figure out other ways to get people to reject fake news rather than having to go through these steps every time they come across an article. So Facebook has actually been doing this quite a lot. They tried a number of different methods. One thing they tried a couple years ago was adding this tag below stories that appear in someone's feed if they've been disputed by third-party fact checkers. And if somebody clicked to share the article, they actually get another pop-up warning saying, like, maybe they didn't notice that first tag to remind them, hey, by the way, this has been disputed, so that people know that this might be a piece of fake news before they share it. Problem solved, right? Unfortunately, a lot of research has been showing, and Facebook's own internal data, that it did not work. It was not effective, and in some cases could actually even backfire and get people to believe the fake news and share it even more. So why would this happen? People have been told that it's likely to be false. Why do people continue believing this? Well, one reason, it fits with existing attitudes. So a lot of times people are coming across these political fake news items that fit with something they already believe or already really want to believe. It's also processed very quickly and uncritically. People are not taking the time to go through all those steps of everything they read online. And finally, the discrediting comes too late. So there's a lot of research in other areas of psychology that find that correcting misinformation once people have accepted it is very hard to do, but that it can be a lot more effective if people know ahead of time. And so that's why in this study, I really wanted to focus on just that last beat, that discrediting too late. Would these warnings be more effective if they came before somebody read the information? So to do that, I recruited a few hundred people, about 500 people in an online survey. And what I did in the survey is I gave people a series of news headlines designed to look like social media cards, just like this. And under each one, on a separate page, I asked people, how much truth do you think there is to this story? And they could rate that on a 5-point scale, from 1 completely false to 5 completely true. So that was the first survey. 2 weeks later, I contacted those same people again. A little over 400 of them returned, and we gave them the same survey again. We gave them the same headlines, and we said, how much truth do you think there is to this story? But mixed in with the 15 true headlines that they read were 3 pieces of fake news that I had entirely made up. There was one that said something bad about Republicans, one that said something bad about Democrats, and one that said something bad about a politically neutral target. And people in the survey were all told that these items were fake, but they were told in different ways that I'm going to be looking at today. So one group of people were given the warning after the headline. So on one page of the survey, they would get the headline, they rated how much truth there was, and then on the next page, they were given a warning that said, by the way, that previous story was completely false. A second group of people were given the warning with the headline, much like Facebook had done in their tagging system, where there was the warning that appeared with the headline as they were making their rating. And then the third group of people, this is kind of the new thing that I'm developing to try to become more effective, was a warning before the headline. So before they could ever see the headline, they got a warning telling them the following story is completely made up, and they had to click to acknowledge that before they could see the headline and make their rating. And so I wanted to be looking at how these different warnings affected people's belief in the truth of the article, both originally and 2 weeks later, where they didn't have warnings present in that follow-up survey. All right, so I'm going to be showing you the results for each of these conditions, and the higher bars means they rated it more on how much truth they thought there was to that story. I also split it up based on whether it was friendly or against a person's political orientation. So for example, a Democrat that is rating the bad news, the bad piece about Republicans would be friendly to them, and when they're rating the bad thing about Democrats, that would be against their political orientation. So with the warning after the headline, again, this is what they rated these before they got the warning, we see moderate levels of belief in the news item. And unsurprisingly, fitting with a lot of past research, people believe the news story that's friendly to their political orientation a good deal more than the one that's against their political orientation. So again, they've now been given the warning in between the original survey and 2 weeks later, and it was completely ineffective. So you might hope that this number would be lower now that they were told in that first survey that the story was false, but that didn't happen. We saw the exact same levels of belief over time. All right, what about the warning with the headline? Well, this was a bit more effective than the original survey. So unlike that first one, you see much lower levels of people believing in the truth of the story when it has that warning tag there. There is still some difference between the friendly and against political orientation. However, and this is why Facebook probably stopped doing this, 2 weeks later this has completely gone away. They are right up with the levels of people who had never seen a warning in the first place and believing this to a moderate degree, even though they knew at one point that this story was false. And so finally, in this third group, we see it's the most effective of all. So we have the lowest levels here, and there's no significant difference between the people reading stories that are friendly to their political orientation and stories that are against their political orientation. So what about 2 weeks later? Completely gone. So once again, even though we gave people this really strong warning that's been effective in other areas of communication psychology, by the time that it's come to 2 weeks later, they have completely forgotten this warning and they are now just believing it. And so just to show those right up next to each other, there's absolutely no difference when we look at the 2 week follow-up between any of the different warning conditions. All right, so one of the takeaways, what works? Well, you might have noticed I focus a lot more on what doesn't work because there's a lot more research and there's unfortunately a lot more things that doesn't work. So even though I had a very strongly worded false tag that said this is completely false, that wasn't effective. Correcting after the information was already presented to people was not effective. And importantly, giving the warning before the information was also not effective. So even though we might have thought that this could work, once you take into consideration the memory over time, which is what it's going to matter out in the real world, we found that this was not effective. So what works? Well, there's a lot less. There's other people that are researching different ways, and we really need a lot more research in this area. So some researchers have found that focusing on trusted, reliable sources is really important, and that when you divorce it from the context of a particular article, people are pretty good at telling what's a reliable source and what's not a reliable source. So that's one avenue of future research. And also the biggest one is going to be limiting the exposure and spread. Once information is out there, it's very hard to correct in an individual person's mind, and so it's going to be extremely important for news organizations, social media, etc., to respond to these calls to try to limit the exposure. So for example, that warning before that I designed could possibly be effective if it causes people to not click on the article in the first place, which is not something I could test in this study, but it's something that we'll be following up with. But what's going to be important is kind of focusing this on the real world and going beyond just the warnings, because unfortunately they just do not seem to be working. All right, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I have two quick questions for you. One is, one's more curiosity of, sorry, I got so excited I lost my train of thought. My question is, how realistic do you think it is that for 2 weeks later, given the amount of data that we consume, that anyone, no matter what kind of tag you use, they would remember something from 2 weeks ago? And also my first point was about, I wonder how much of us click on the fake news just out of curiosity. Ooh, what's this?
Mm-hmm. I think both of those are really important to address in a real world study. In terms of the amount of data that we get, I think you're exactly right, and that's exactly the problem. We get so much information that it's likely not going to happen. Now, people were decently good. I don't have the exact numbers offhand, but we asked people if they remembered seeing it in the first one, so we do have that information, and people generally remember that they've seen it. The problem is what happens is people forget exactly where they saw it, and they forget the details. So it just kind of seems familiar, like, oh yeah, I saw this before, and a lot of people don't even remember that it was in the survey, but some of them think they saw it out in the real world. Because our brain just accepts the information, they kind of forget exactly where it's from. And I think that's exactly the problem in the real world, is that we're focusing on these warnings and these corrections, and those just don't make it in because we get so much information. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why it's important to look at this 2 weeks later. The fact that we see a lot of memory loss is kind of exactly the point that I want to study. So that was your first question. Can you remind me of the second one?
There's just an observation that, it's how how much of it is we click on the fake news, even though it's
Oh, yeah.
just because, ooh, it's, you know, shiny, what is that?
Yeah, that's hard to say, and that's one thing that's been interesting, so I've seen, I don't have access to any Facebook internal data, but I've seen them present at some conferences in this area where that one of the things that they have been criticizing some of the researchers studying fake news on Facebook by saying that we don't know exactly, they don't have this real world data, we don't know if they're just clicking on it to know, they don't know if they're sharing it with, you know, ironically or to say like this is false, but I think the problem is that even if somebody is doing that, it can be very hard for that to stick over time. So even if somebody clicks just because they're curious, or even somebody shares it just to say this is false, I honestly think that's still going to have a really negative impact.
Right.
That person might forget over time that that was just a made-up thing, and they might just remember the information. And even if they share it knowing it's false, somebody else might see it and kind of miss that nuance and just pick up on the information.
Very
And so I think that's kind of just as dangerous, unfortunately.
Very cool, thank you.
Do you have any sense of the disparity in terms of like, education level or political affiliation in terms of the belief in fake news?
I have a little bit on that. So in my own research, I can talk a little bit about my data, a little bit about other people's data. So a recent study came out that found one of the biggest drivers of sharing fake news is age, not just education, but that older people are a lot more likely than younger people to be sharing fake news. In my own data, I did not find that age was a significant factor, or education, or political party. So those were not significantly different in my own data. The one demographic factor, so this is I've done a few different studies on fake news, and the one that's come out consistent across all of them is how much people believe in conspiracy theories. So if people just in general believe more in conspiracy theories, they're a lot more likely to accept all of the fake news is true. I also have one study with some questionable data that I don't want to put, like, you know, there's some reasons we might have found this, but there was no general liberal conservative difference, but Trump supporters were much higher than others in believing fake news. When we segmented off people that had supported Trump since the Republican primary, I did a fake news study over the course of the election, they were a lot more likely to believe all fake news that we gave them, even when it was negative about Trump. And so it wasn't just a Democrat or Republican, but a very particular subset that were believing more often. And that could just have to do with the conspiracy theory correlation as well. It's something that I'm still following up with.
Do you think that's, when you tested like the Trump supporters, did you put the warning label of like this is fake or?
That was a different study that I found that, and I did not have warning labels. That was, I had done this longitudinal study over the 2016 election, and in one part of that, one of the random surveys that we gave them, we had a list of stories, like just a single sentence of something happened, and we're like, do you remember this happening or not? And a few of those items had not happened, and we just looked at percentage of people that remembered seeing it. And we were looking for a difference in the political orientation difference. So people are more likely to falsely remember something that's for their that supported their candidate. And we found that we didn't find most people were rejecting most of them, except that the people who we had known from our earlier surveys who were supporting Trump were like 5 times more likely to believe all the items across the board that we were seeing than other groups. And so that one did not have warnings. It was just a really quick, here's 20 items, do you remember this happening or not? And then we're like, okay, just so you know, these ones didn't happen, which I now know might not have been very effective.
Very cool, thank you.